to our session. So our session is on technology, remote technology, and supports. And along with me presenting is Jordan Wagner, who's the project coordinator, the guy with the orange shirt and had the orange mic before. I love the color coordination that the AV people do. And Dan Davies, who's a consultant with us and working with us on this project. And so the three of us are going to share this presentation, and I'll try and go quickly through my part. In Ohio, we have a lot of excitement now around technology, starting with our governor, Governor Kasich, who's really excited about the role that technology can play in the life of adults with developmental disabilities. And that's pioneered a lot by our state DD director, John Martin, who's leading the charge, and gave us a charge to look at how what we call remote supports in our state DD waivers. There's a service that's provided through the three different waivers that we have, which involves the use of technology to support adults in living independently. And I was at a breakout session this morning with that was given by Kara Alice Bruhart and Catherine Carroll. And I thought it was really fascinating to hear them talk about how technology can really support self-determined life or living a good life. And this is sort of what we're talking about in terms of remote supports, is really sort of like providing an alternative or a different pathway to having direct support staff, providing direct support in the home of individuals. And a lot of the technology that we've been talking about and we're looking at is sensor technology. And we heard a lot of different presentations today about sensor technology, whether it's motion detectors, door window sensors, heat detectors, medication dispenser reminders. And there's a lot of apps and off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box technology can help a lot with this in terms of providing remote support. Also involves, in many instances, sort of two-way communication, either audio or audio and video communication, where people providing remote support can call in and just check in and make sure everything's okay. Or if the door opens up at 3 a.m., they can call and say, where are you going, or who's coming in at this time. And this provides a constant in connection with the individual living in the home. In some instances, there's video capability. And in our state, what we've been realizing and what we've been noticing is that we need to do a lot of education, both to what we call supports and services administrator or support brokers, case managers, and family members, because the conception of remote supports is that we have video cameras in the people's home, in their room, in their bathroom, and that's just not the case. In some instances, when video cameras are used, they may be on a door, on a front door or a back door, and they're activated, again, if there's a sensor that says the door is open, and it's at a certain time when there's some concern, and we just want to make sure that we know who's coming in or who's leaving. Other aspects, so again, our DD waivers in Ohio provide individuals the ability to purchase equipment using their waiver funds, as well as pay for remote monitoring and remote supports through the DD waiver, and that's a part that's really exciting. I wanted to show you a short video. This is a short 2-minute video that that our state DD departments developed to help promote the education of what remote supports is about. If you can start that, that'd be great.
Brad likes soccer and hanging out with friends. He also has a developmental disability. That means different things for different people. But for Brad, it means that he sometimes has seizures and has trouble remembering things. He uses tools like lists and calendars to help keep him on track. Brad also has a family that loves him a lot. When Brad told them he was ready to live on his own, they wanted to support him. and they were concerned about his health and safety. The service and support coordinator that helps Brad coordinate his services through his County Board of Developmental Disabilities talked to Brad about remote monitoring. Remote monitoring is a Medicaid-funded waiver service that uses technology to promote a person's independence and safety by having staff in a remote location. There are a lot of different tools available through remote monitoring, things like sensors that trigger alarms, as well as door cameras and monitors. Remote monitoring tools can be customized to best fit someone's needs, no matter their age or their disability. Brad needed a tool that could help him if he had a seizure while he was home alone. He uses sensors installed in floor mats to help detect if his movements become irregular and can alert someone remotely of a possible problem. He needed a tool to help him when he forgets things like taking medicine or turning the water off after using the sink, so his sink has a flood detector that shuts off the water if Brad forgets to do it. He also uses a medication dispenser that alerts him if he hasn't taken his pills. It can even send his family a text message if he misses it a second time. The remote monitoring tools Brad uses every day support him in being more independent in his daily routine and help him live on his own. The tools put his family at ease because they know he is safe. They also know that they will get an alert if something goes wrong. Brad now gets to live more of the life he wants. Thanks for watching.
All right, so that's a short animation that was developed recently to help educate supports brokers and case managers and family members around what is, and adults with developmental disabilities, what is remote supports. I wanted to present you with a couple of examples of people we've met recently who've started using remote supports. One of them is John, who's living at home with his parents, and not uncommon to a lot of individuals that you know and we know. He was a young man who had been really excited and wanting to move out and live on his own, but his parents were really anxious about his safety and his ability to live independently on his own and not wanting to set him up for failure. So the parents inquired about remote supports and actually renovated as a sort of like a transition, renovated their garage. I don't know if any of you have seen garages that are renovated into sort of a small apartments, but this was a very nice renovation. So he had a 1-bedroom, he had a kitchen and a living room. And along with remote supports, the parents were able to monitor him and make sure that he was safe. And within a year, he actually moved into his own apartment. He was so successful, and his family was so pleased with how well he did. And now he continues to live on his own and has some remote monitoring. And actually, all of the backup and supports are provided by his family, and that's worked out very well. Another example is Mary, who's a young woman who we often have a tendency, one of my areas of interest is challenging behavior, and we often have a tendency of wanting to staff challenging behavior, if you pardon that expression. So when people have a lot of challenging behavior, often when family and the individual meet, and our reflex is to say, well, let's increase the number of direct support staff there. And what we realized with Mary is, when we backed out the staff and replaced a lot of the staff by sensor technology and monitors and two-way communication, the frequency and intensity of her challenging behavior decreased substantially. And she was actually much happier with less staff in her home, which I think most of us can really relate to when you stop and think about it. So these are a couple of good examples that we wanted to share. So in Ohio, we have 37,000 people, and we know that thanks to our state DD services, but also State of the States, which provides us with a lot of that rich information. So how many people do you think out of the 37,000 who are eligible and could purchase remote supports on their waiver actually purchase that? If I were to ask you, do you think it's more than 10,000, 5,000? Five? Amy's got the inside track. Actually, it's 170 people, 170 individuals in the whole state. So our governor and our state DD director really charged us this past year with this project to say, identify what's happening. Why are people not taken up this opportunity to use technology to be able to move out or be more independent or to rely less on support staff? And we know that in Ohio, like in most states, there is a bit of a crisis around direct support staff, finding staff, training staff, retaining staff. And this is not to replace all direct support staff, but allow us to reallocate direct support staff to areas where we may not have an alternative, but in areas where technology may serve as well. Why not? So we're trying to identify by meeting with individuals, their families, and others, what are the barriers, what are the impediments to using and implementing technology in the home, and trying to identify as well what are the emerging technologies. And we heard today a lot of exciting technology that's on the horizon that we hope we can learn about and bring into the developmental disabilities world. So Jordan will talk a little bit about the surveys and the interviews and the focus groups we've been running, and then Dan will talk a little bit about the emerging technologies that we're looking towards to help not only people be independent in their home, but be independent at work, be independent in engaging and moving about in their community. Thank you.
We conducted preliminary focus groups with self-advocates as well as with parents. And we asked them, this is a group of people, by the way, that do not really know much about remote services. Many of them were discovering about it from us when we went to go speak with them. And so this group of self-advocates, we asked them, what do you like about this service? What do you like about remote supports? And they said that they really liked this idea that it promotes independence. They liked the safety that it promotes as well. And many of these individuals with developmental disabilities will have someone come to the home and spend the night at their home. One of the things that this group was particularly excited about is perhaps the idea that remote supports could take away some of those supports during the nighttime. However, despite this excitement, the group was concerned about privacy and relational interaction. You know, they felt like, would someone be watching all the time? If I don't have a direct support in the home, am I going to be less relational? Am I going to have less relational time with people? And then the group of parents were fairly skeptical. You know, they said, this service, it sounds good, but I'm not really sure if this is something that would actually benefit my son or daughter. Some of their concerns involved privacy, technology use. Would their son or daughter be able to use the technology? Would someone be able to hack in? Does this service even provide an adequate amount of attention to their son or daughter? And then later, after we'd been doing these focus groups for a little while, we got with a group of 16 family members and we asked them what would be most disconcerting from this list, right? We asked them from privacy, hacking, the use of technology, safety, or paying inadequate attention to their son or daughter. What do you find most concerning? And they said the number one concern was safety. So remember these as we go through the results that we've collected so far. Oh, that was the wrong button. In Ohio, there's 88 counties. 44 of them have somebody in that county that uses remote supports. And we were able to either survey or have participants from 20 of those 44 counties. Of those who participated, 21 of them were adults who use remote supports, and 27 of them were guardians of those who use remote supports. And 7 of the respondents are people whose guardian had also provided a response. So what that does, it provides us with 43 unique responses, and that's just about it's just over a quarter of the entire population of the 170 people that use remote supports. Two-thirds of those respondents were female, and the ages ranged from 21 to 74. Most people had been using the service for less than 5 years. And we also received responses from people that had used remote supports in the past, but had actually decided to stop using them. We had responses from 17% of people that fall into that category. And when asked, why did you begin remote supports? These are open-ended questions, right? So the responses that we received back, 66% of them said that they started it because of independence, because of the independence that remote supports affords. When asked, what do you like about remote supports? 53% said that they like the emergency support aspect, while 47% once again mentioned the independence that can potentially come from remote supports. And I separated this into what did the Guardian say and what did the users say. And the users of remote supports, their number one thing that they liked was actually the remote staff. In one of the focus groups that we conducted, there were 2 individuals that had stopped using remote supports. And we asked them, what is it that you like about, or what is it that you had liked about remote supports? And they said, well, you know what we really miss is the conversations that we had with the remote monitoring staff. They miss the relationships that they built there. And so that is very different from what this from the preliminary focus groups that we did. People were afraid that they would become less social. But in fact, what we see here is that those relationships are maintained with the staff. And then the Guardians, their number one things were tied between independence and emergency supports. So health is mentioned there as well. 34% said that they like health. 53%, as I said, emergency support, and 34% home security. But if we take emergency supports and home security and we identify how many people said emergency support or home security or both, we see that 31 respondents fell into that category. So if we were to create a new category, just call it safety, we would see that 66% of them like that aspect of remote supports. Independence, again, is a really big factor in this. When participants talked about independence, they included that they had less staff, including the overnight staffing that I mentioned earlier. And then Mark already mentioned that at least in one instance, remote supports helped this individual to actually move out of his parents' home. Now, we also asked, what do you not like about remote supports? And privacy concerns was the number one thing, but we'll get to that in a minute. What this question does is it exposes what the barriers are to success. And so that includes paying for paying for internet as well as organizing the backup. So the backup is if there's ever a power outage, then somebody would have to come to the home. And organizing that has been a difficulty for some people in Ohio. It also exposes what is it that we should be addressing. And technical support is one of the things that was mentioned. Many of these supports are happening from very remote distances. So perhaps even someone from Indiana would be remotely supporting people in Ohio. So if you have a problem with your technology, it might take a day or 2 for someone to come in and assist with technology difficulties. We also found that there were difficulties maintaining contact information. So that's something that we could look into updating. And then also developing more detailed protocols. I spoke with one woman in one of our focus groups who said that her sister went to the hospital for pneumonia. And when she got out of the hospital, they requested, may we have a direct support staff in the home for the time that she's recovering from pneumonia. And in this particular instance, they said no. And I'm not saying that that's that's the way that it was designed, that's the way that it should be. But if there were a more detailed protocol, perhaps they could write in there that when someone is physically ill, that in that instance, it would be better to have somebody in the home. Now let's talk about privacy, right? 32% of respondents said that they had concerns with the privacy of remote supports. They said they didn't like the cameras. Some of them said they felt babysat. They felt like people were watching all the time. And therefore, one of the things families may need to consider is whether or not the technology that they're using is something that is the least intrusive option. Are there other technologies, perhaps sensor technologies, that can assist in this way, in the same way that a camera may be used, that will make the individual living there feel more comfortable at home? And despite this, when asked how much privacy do you feel in the home, 91% felt that they had privacy. 44%, that's 20 of 45 respondents, said that they felt they had lots of privacy, while 47% said they felt at least some privacy in the home. Dan?
Sir? All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about not the remote monitoring technologies, but the other types of technologies that can be useful in this arena, because the state of Ohio recognizes that it's not just the remote support technology that is going to be an important factor in the future of services for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So one of the areas that I'm working with these gentlemen is in the area of these non-sensor-based technologies or personal support types of technologies. Both of these together, though, can have an impact on the workforce crisis that's ahead of us. And a lot of times, I know when agencies introduce the concept of remote monitoring technology to staff, and there's somewhat of a resistance from the DSPs worried about their jobs. Well, they're not watching the news, because there's not going to be much worry about jobs for DSPs into the future because of the workforce crisis itself. The technology is there to try to help resolve and get by this difficult time that we have facing ahead of us. But the individuals, the DSPs, are going to be critically involved in providing those supports that they have been, and in implementing and utilizing the technologies that become available. So they become a partnership, really. It's not a replacement type situation. So anyways, that technology has the opportunity to really be part of the solution regarding the workforce crisis. So when we broaden the scope of technology for folks with intellectual disabilities, we're talking about looking at across the life spectrum, really. Where can technology be used to provide assistance to individuals? We've been talking a lot so far about in the home. But what about when the individual leaves the home and travels in the community or goes to work? What kind of technologies can be used in those scenarios, as well as other technologies that could be used in the home that are not sensor-based technologies? This slide here kind of summarizes some of those different areas. One is in the area of self-expression. Technology can be used to support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities regarding enabling them to communicate their own thoughts and impressions, or maybe satisfaction with services they're receiving through accessible surveys, or just creation of new content. Folks that have have limited literacy skills, don't have the ability to journal or things like that, need alternative ways to express themselves and tell stories that are from themselves. I'll show you an example in just a moment. Accessing the community is another area. I did a session earlier today, and the focus of that was on transportation technologies for folks with cognitive disabilities. And so enabling individuals to travel on their own without requiring, individuals to drive them from one place to another if they don't, have the skills to gain a driver's license and things like that. That's another area where technology can be useful for folks. Knowing when and how to do things is a key part of everyone's life. Knowing that it's time to do something, your schedule, and then knowing how to do those things. Those are some of the kind of the time-tested areas where technology has been used for folks with cognitive disabilities. I'll show you some examples of those as well. And then accessing everyday technology are kind of ways in which cognitive technology can be used by folks with disabilities to do the same types of things that everybody else is doing with technology. That might be email, just surfing the web, doing video chats, etc. Oftentimes the user interfaces of applications on mainstream programs can be too complicated to operate. So there's the opportunity to make everyday technologies more accessible for folks. Here's a story of self-expression with Matt here. I'll give you just a little example. Digital Storyteller is a system that allows individuals to kind of tell their own story based upon maybe a trip to the zoo or something where, pictures are taken by the individual themselves or, family members or others that they're with. And with Digital Storyteller, the individual has the ability to add their own verbal recordings to each that associate with each picture in the story to kind of end up with a video diary of that event, the trip to the zoo or whatever. Matt was one of the individuals participating in kind of the research and development phase of this system. So in this system, what Matt did was he would select a folder of pictures. In this case, it was just a few pictures about sea creatures, and I think he did a few different ones. And he would select a picture and then tell verbally what that what was in that picture, or what some information about it, and create his own story. And at the end, you could listen to it. So you'd see a picture, and you'd hear Matt's voice, and then you'd see another picture. And the idea with this technology is to help individuals express themselves, with a creative outlet. So here's a short video after Matt did this and then listened to it. I asked him about it. So go ahead and play that video there, if you would.
Amazing animals.
Welcome to Digital Storyteller.
What did you do with the iPad today, Matt?
I looked up the sea ocean creatures and giraffes and the tigers and the very awesome bones.
Okay. And what did you do with those pictures?
I added them into a huge new book.
A new book. Okay. All right. A book that you made.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you get to listen to it?
Yes.
What did you think of that?
I think it was amazing.
All right. Did you have fun?
I had I had really lots of fun today.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Matt. All right, so there's an example of self-expression for Matt. I mentioned accessing the community. Yeah, technologies are available that use GPS location information, and that can be personalized with pictures and verbal instructions to help individuals guide themselves from home to work, or different things like that. There's also technologies to help with knowing when to do things, part of those daily tasks. So here's some examples of picture-based systems that provide that type of information to help a person get through their day more independently. In addition to knowing when to do things, as I mentioned, knowing how to do things is important. So video modeling applications that can provide assistance to individuals to perform those tasks of daily living. These are particularly useful in those situations where, and it kind of relates to the DSP's role we've got a lot of feedback from organizations and individuals using this type of technology where instead of having to go in and help an individual do laundry or cook dinner, with these technologies, the individuals can do these things themselves so that when the staff come, they get to do higher quality interactions with the individual, and they get to go out into the community and do the things that they never get a chance to do because they're doing the more mundane things. So video modeling applications are a technology that can assist with that area. These can be taken anywhere you need to go. So in a work site, for example, this is a couple of screenshots from a video of a gentleman using this tablet computer attached to his work cart. This guy works in Chicago, works along with Trinity services out there, and he would follow his step-by-step instructions for how to do the different tasks in the work setting in that way. There are ways to make technology, whether it be a mobile device or a tablet computer or just a desktop computer, more accessible to folks with cognitive disabilities through the accessible operating systems, which basically sit on top of the regular interface of a computer to make the technologies available within that computer more usable and accessible to folks with cognitive disabilities. This is an example of the Smart Living Suite. With these types of systems, you can really personalize the content and the computing experience for an individual so they can focus on the things that are important to them. They don't have to worry about all the other, unnecessary things on a computer desktop. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jordan at this time.
These technologies are not meant to replace the role of a direct support caregiver. There will always be a need for caregivers in the home. This technology, as said before, really ought to create opportunities for those who need caregivers in the home to receive the best care in the best ways possible. And so, in conclusion, with advancements in technology, people with developmental disabilities will have the opportunity to live more independent and socially engaged lives. Technology, including remote supports, may be one piece of the solution to the direct support shortage. Thank you. And are there any questions? Okay.
Inform other states. Trying to catch you on time. Oh, yeah. And the second is, did the survey and the focus groups, have you considered or did you talk to individuals, family members who had considered remote monitoring but rejected it? I understand you've talked to people who are using remote monitoring and what they liked and didn't. But the flip side is somebody who's rejected it might reveal barriers of more significance.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, the information we collect will be made available.
Great.
And then to answer your second question, we have not yet, but that is something that we are, that's essentially the very next step that we're working on now. We have surveys we're going to be sending out to families all over Ohio, and the intention is to collect many who have considered remote supports but have rejected it. Please.
I thought your questions are excellent, right on. And one of the things that we're exploring in Ohio, much like Colorado, we're an employment first state, but there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of buzz around maybe taking that model of employment first and transposing it to technology and start talking about being a technology first state as well. And of course, those two go hand in hand where, with, 77% or 75% unemployment or underemployment of adults with developmental disabilities, technology, and there's a lot of presentations today about that. So yeah, and your point, as Jordan mentioned, also asking family members, why did you decide not to do remote monitoring if you're aware of it? A lot of the families we expect that we will survey will tell us they had never heard of it. But those who've heard of it and chose not to do it, we definitely want to know why. Good question.
We have time for one more?
Any more questions? Oh, there's one in the back, sorry.
I'm sorry, I missed you.
I'm sorry, I was beside you. So people's waivers are paying for the remote supports. How did you decide on how much the payment would be? This is what states are asking me. Is it less than face-to-face supports? How much less? Is it different than indirect? How did you come up with that category? What is it, and how does it compare to the other categories?
So, I'll answer for Dan. I'm going to channel Dan here, and I'm going to say, ideally, the backup would be natural supports. That would be the ideal. One thing we'd love to do is have the feedback loop come back to the adult and say, hey, we noticed you're in bed, but your stove is still on. Go down and turn it off. Not have staff or paid people go. In Ohio right now, backup paid staff, if it's a paid staff, I believe, and Jordan's going to correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's something like $7 an hour. And often that's split between, if there's a different provider providing the remote monitoring, they might get $3 an hour to provide the remote monitoring. And if homemaker provider care staff needs to come, the agency that provides that staff might get $4 an hour for the backup staff there. And I'm checking Jordan to make sure my numbers are right. What a lot of providers are now beginning to realize, what they thought before it was like a bad deal, what they're beginning to realize now is actually you can have the same backup staff providing backup for a dozen people, because in many instances they're never really activated. So it does become financially an appealing option for many staff in using this backup option with the use of technology. Does that answer your question? And if you want more specifics, we can give you exact dollar amounts. Our different waivers allocate different maximums in terms of how much can be spent on the waiver, but our independent options waiver, there is no cap for that one. Yes, and that's all part, and that's intricately tied back to the individual support plan, and it's all personalized, and it's all individualized. And if technology is really not the best option, it's not really for after that analysis. And that has been the case in some instances too. I know the other session is going to start. We'd be happy to talk to you some more. Thank you again.